Today, I'm delighted again to be joined by Christopher Forsback, who is a Swedish volunteer with the Ukrainian army. He was injured in the line of duty, and he now trains with the armed forces of Ukraine. In fact, trains the armed forces of Ukraine. He is an expert trainer and an indispensable asset to Ukraine. I'm catching him now before he heads off somewhere, which we probably won't mention in the video, but I'm delighted to welcome you back. And of course, if you enjoyed this episode, if you find this valuable, do check out the previous episodes that we've recorded. There's extraordinary detail in there about the training programs for Ukrainian armed forces and insights into that. Please also do check out the validated Ukrainian charities. It's incredibly important to support charities that are genuinely Ukrainian and genuinely doing work in the country and spend that money within the Ukrainian economy and helping the Ukrainian civilians and army to remain resilient. Christopher, welcome back to the channel.
Thank you.
Well, let's start with, I think, what is the big debate. I mean, there's lots of stuff going on in the news at the moment, but the big debate that seems to be playing out amongst so-called foreign policy experts, so-called expert military analysts, is whether Kursk was a risky sideshow and a mistake, a kind of ego trip by Zelenskyy and his team, and whether they should have really concentrated on Pokrovsk and the southern front to hold the line against Russian advances there. I tend not to side with those experts and think Kursk is a sort of a genius move in many ways, and the full impact of it won't be known, I think, possibly even until the war is over. But you're there on the ground. Is this same kind of debate playing out in Ukraine, or are people much more behind the Kursk incursion and whatever benefits it's thought to bring?
We don't really discuss it that much. I don't follow the Ukrainian news and TV, but it's been a blessing in a kind. Morale was getting lower and lower before this. The only area that was talked about was Pokrovsk, and we were backing and backing and backing in that area. But after the incursion into Kursk, you can see the morale, and especially from the civilian side, really boosting over this. We're having some successes. I don't know whether or not it was planned. I don't really think so. I think they saw a chance and just took it. This is my personal opinion about it. But yeah, it's worked out fine.
And morale is incredibly important at this point, isn't it? We're in the third year of the war. Now, the energy infrastructure was pretty resilient through last winter, but Russia has really tried to take out as much infrastructure as it can. And of course, we had this deficit, this period where Western munitions, especially US munitions, were not being supplied when they had the impasse in Congress. Russia has certainly used that period of a air defense deficit, a munitions deficit, to take out as much of Ukrainian infrastructure as it can. This winter promises to be a harder one. How important then is this boost for morale at this time, not just for military, and we'll turn to that in a minute, but actually the civilian population?
Well, I would say it's incredibly important. As you said, it's the third year. People are getting tired. I know I'm a bit tired, so everybody is. But yeah, it really put us back to early 23 in the morale again, and especially among the civilians.
And one of the, I mean, there's a couple of interesting aspects of Kursk, which I've talked about with various guests on the channel. My view is that there is the two incredibly significant things that Kursk does. One is it seeks to push Russia into additional mobilization, because in order to try to retake those territories, they need significant numbers of troops, and it highlights a kind of deficit that Russia has of certainly not just trained troops, but any bodies it can throw at the problem. So it seems particularly clever to force Russia into doing that at the same time, and that's actually seemed to be working. They have increased their They've even announced, a new wave of mobilization. Not the full mobilization, which I think Zelenskyy was hoping for, but it's putting this immense pressure on the military's ability to get bodies to the front. The other one is maneuver warfare. And with the Russians throwing relatively untrained people at the problem, does the advantage that Ukraine has created a space where they can actually put into practice some of the NATO training? How important is it that Ukraine is redefining the terms of the battlefield and not just playing Russia's rules in terms of an attritional, long, slow, sort of bleeding fight down in Pokrovsk?
Of course, that's really important, but the Battle of Kursk actually started in Ukraine as the Second Battle of Kharkiv when the Russians tried to come in. There was a lot of criticism about Ukrainian forces not defending at the border, losing villages and stuff like that. But we did stop that assault and then turned it into our own offensive. And in a way, I think that's the morale boost of it. People saw that the army could actually do something else than just defend or back off. But going from a defensive to an offensive fight within a rather small area of the front lines was extremely important. And especially for the army, showing that we can do this. We're not only limited to being able to defend or to do offensive movements in small units.
And you've been training some of those troops over the last couple of months. Has it been a frustration that the sort of skills and techniques that you were seeing starting to sort of be absorbed by certain units in the army were not sort of on display or had the opportunity for people to sort of see that? And how important actually is that for Western partners to also see the capabilities and the fact that this training is not just not wasted, but Ukrainians can really sort of absorb it, turn it round, and demonstrably achieve victories using these techniques?
Well, we've been fighting for 2.5 years. If we weren't learning, this would have been over for a long time ago. Unfortunately, so does the Russians. But of course it's important. If we can't show that we evolve and that we learn and adapt to the scenarios put ahead of us, I don't think the foreign aid would be as significant as it has been at all. There's no point in pouring billions after billions over a country that doesn't care or doesn't learn or isn't interested in doing these things.
And it seems in Russia's response to Kursk is not what most Western analysts were thinking. They were thinking that Russia was going to prize territory in Kursk above territory in Ukraine, especially cities that Russia's done a tremendous effort at destroying, reducing to rubble. The logical thing would be for Russia to withdraw and defend its own territory. But this does not seem to be how Putin thinks. The propaganda value of taking territory in Kursk and places seems to be higher. And it's this informational struggle which he seems to place more value on than the loss of Russian territory, which is an extraordinary kind of thing. That can't go on forever, though. If Ukraine carries on grabbing more Russian territory, there comes a point, I think, when this is clearly going to be a major embarrassment for Putin and his regime.
A big part of the plan right now, to be honest with you. And talking about how Putin reacts to the Kursk incursion right now, it's a fairly small area that's been taken. He held a lot more Ukrainian territory than all the Russian. So far, it's not a panic for him, I think. And Pokrovsk, I would say, is a lot of a bigger prize for him than retaking Kursk right now. So I think he's basically just looking for PR back home to be able to get more manpower, and then he'll try and slam down.
Certainly until the first couple of weeks of the Kursk incursion, we were under the impression that this completely caught the Russians by surprise. We're now learning that actually they were monitoring the buildup of troops. They did have people reporting back to Putin and potentially the military hierarchy that Ukraine was planning something in this area. So that puts a slightly different light on it. The fact that Ukraine was able to punch through, take territory so rapidly, break through whatever electronic warfare and so on, and fortifications Russia put in place. The fact that this was potentially expected and Ukraine still won, that in some ways, to my mind, makes it more impressive and perhaps talks to the detail that must have gone into the planning of the mission.
Don't really believe that side of the story. To be honest with you, we were, if you remember back in March, we were expecting a Russian attack in the Kharkiv Sumy area. We were building up troops already back in March to meet that attack. And what I think happened, to be honest with you, I don't have any proof about this, but what I think happened was that when the Kharkiv offensive stalled for them, they pulled more and more troops into that, and they weren't thinking about the troops we had standing at Sumy. So when we got the chance, yeah, we sent those guys in.
This makes Kirk sound more opportunistic than, an extensively sort of planned operation. And in fact, the secrecy surrounding it seemed to be pretty impressive, in such that allies themselves had little or no awareness that this was going to take place. At least, again, that's the story that's put out at the moment, that allies were completely ignorant of it. Maybe history will show that something else actually was going on behind the scenes. If it was opportunistic, then that makes it easier to believe how security was maintained. Because if you're going to have a long, long planning process, as you would have had something around D-Day in the Second World War, you need an extraordinary sort of veil of secrecy to keep that going. That's quite a challenge even now. That's quite a challenge, I think, in Ukraine to keep things like that quiet.
Well, that would be extremely difficult to keep secret in Ukraine. I know, look at last year, the Russians knew exactly where we were coming and in a fairly good time span when we were coming. So, no, there's too many eyes in Ukraine seeing shit and reporting about it. Or you don't even have to tell the Russians, because Telegram is an extremely common app used here, and they send everything over that fucker. I don't even have it on my phone because I don't trust it at all. But unfortunately, in Ukraine, it's the most common app. It's like Instagram back home.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's been a worry for quite some time, and I think amongst those fighting sort of disinformation on the home front, I think we've all pretty much dropped Telegram as a means of communication, and agree with you that it is extremely compromised. Is it likely then, and given that the founder was recently arrested in France, are there going to be moves potentially for Ukraine to start really pushing this out as a means, when you really need secrecy, when you need secure communications, moving to things like Signal and WhatsApp, which are potentially not compromised in the same way?
I would guess so. Signal is fairly common here even now, and it's getting bigger and bigger. I mean, 99% of us foreigners are only using Signal. We basically have Telegram to look who and where you're getting posted on some fucking Russian shit page, tracking mercs and stuff like that. But even a lot of Ukrainians, and I mean a lot of Ukrainians, are doing Signal.
That would seem to be a sensible move. Well, let's turn to the extraordinary news coming out last week and over the weekend, and this is the explosion of three or even four major arsenals, repositories of munitions in Tarapets and Tikharetski in particular. We all saw the spectacular images. So again, from a morale standpoint and from a information warfare standpoint, these are spectacular. They show Ukraine being bold, highly competent, and the Russians sort of being the opposite there. But what might be the strategic importance of that if they have genuinely destroyed thousands, if not tens of thousands, of rounds of ammunition and missiles? Is this going to protect civilians more, or is there perhaps some military benefits from these strikes?
Uh, I don't think it's going to do a great difference for most civilians because I don't think they were storing ammunition, so long range ammunitions here. This is more frontline stuff. And yeah, this will have a great impact on the front lines. Because I would guess most of the ammunitions being used right now are being drawn from these arsenals.
And
So yeah,
without, yeah, and it was reported as well that one of the reasons why one of them went up so spectacularly was because North Korean ammunition had just been delivered, and they hadn't yet had time to put it away in silos. It was there in the open air. Nonetheless, do you think these Russian arsenals are not quite built to withstand the kind of forces and pressures that the makers claim for them? There are, of course, always suspicions that the people who got enormous budgets in order to build these silos, a lot of that may have built rather fine country houses for them as opposed to the concrete silos that were required.
well, I would put it like this: concrete made under the Soviet era are normally really good. After that, maybe not so much. So yeah, first of all, I think, as you said, this was in the big, really spectacular explosion that has to have been a lot of ammunition stored outside. That's not just one bunker going up. That is a tremendous amount of ammunition. I'm fairly jealous that I wasn't the one doing that explosion, but yeah, maybe in the future. But more than that, as far as I've understood, most of that depot was fairly new built, so I would not be surprised if the structures did not keep up to specs at all.
And what do we know of Russian logistics? Because these obviously are huge silos. The assumption is that not everything comes directly from there to the front line, but they might have, intermediary arsenals, various waypoints, and other logistical points where smaller amounts of ammunition are kept. Is it going to be more difficult to track those down and take out the sort of smaller to medium size storage points?
No, I don't really think so. I mean, look, all of Russian logistics is based on rails. So follow the rails to the offloading sites. You can hit the ammunition there, or you can just wait until the trucks pick it up and follow them to where they're storing it. So that's not brain surgery. That's quite easy.
Well, that's good news. That doesn't sound particularly sophisticated, so that's great. The other impact of this, of course, is to show not just Ukrainian competence and boldness, but also that deep strike capabilities are incredibly important strategically and can help Ukraine on the battlefield because there's been some extraordinarily perverse arguments, including ones put out by the US administration, and this is probably to cover their tracks and excuses to make up for the non-permission given to, say, attackers on the territory of Russia, but they've been making the argument that actually this kind of deep strike capability won't really have an effect. It's not really important, so let's just not worry about this. Ukraine's action here seems to suggest quite the opposite, that even though Russia might have moved some of their longer range bombers away from those airfields that would have been within attack and strike, having these longer range munitions could have a huge and positive impact. I mean, that's what I'm getting out of the strikes that we see at the weekend.
Of course it has. That's pure bullshit that it wouldn't have any effect. I mean, look at the tactics that our armies would employ in a case of a conflict. Yeah, it's hitting the rear areas. That's where it hurts. If you can't get the shit to the boys at the front, they can't fight. That's been a fact since the Stone Age. If you can't get the guy in the front, the big guy in the front, a wooden club, yeah, the small guy on the other side with a wooden club is going to beat him up. And it doesn't matter if it's a wooden club or an attacker. If you can't get the ammunition into the tubes, you can't fight, period.
And last time we spoke, it was in the depths of the ammunition famine. And even when the impasse in the US ended, it seemed to take several months for ammunition to start to sort of trickle down and get to where it's needed. One would assume that if Ukraine is going on the offensive, then the demand for ammunition is greater than if it's defensive. And Zelenskyy is in Washington this week. He even visited a ammunition factory to emphasize the importance of that. So do you think the US really, and allies, of course, need to sort of step up? And despite, increased supplies, I would assume that Ukraine needs more even now than is being supplied.
Yeah, we do. I mean, everybody back home thinks that we are delivering vast amounts of weaponry for this war, that Ukraine is basically only fighting with Western weapons. Western weapons are a very small percentage of what we're using. They're better than the old Russian shit that we have, but it's a very, very small part of this conflict. So yeah, step it up and step it up fast.
Exactly, because that sort of 6 months of the ammunition famine took a terrible toll in Ukrainian military and talent and so on. And if ammunition is not being supplied, if the allies are not visibly supporting Ukraine, giving everything that's required, it becomes really difficult to sell the message of mobilization, doesn't it? It's a tough ask to ask people to join the army and send them to the front if they're not given the right kit to do the job.
Of course. I mean, even if we were on par with the Russians at our low points and trading 1-to-1, everybody knows we're going to lose. We need to have a 5-to-1 ratio towards the enemy to actually have a chance. And if we are not supplied the equipment that we need, and even though this might sound weird, it's the equipment is vital to be able to maintain that type of ratio. And yeah, Ukraine can't right now manufacture all this stuff on their own, and so we need to step up. I mean, look at Sweden and Finland. They joined NATO. We stayed out of NATO for the entire Cold War, and now we go back. Now we go in. That should send a message to people that, oh shit, this might be dangerous. This might escalate a lot faster than we thought. We didn't have an issue staying outside of NATO during the Cold War when the Soviet and the US was dealing. But now we're going in.
That should send a message, shouldn't it? And in fact, I was in Denmark and Sweden over the summer on holiday, as we said, not related to the channel. And you do get a sense there of, I would say, a sort of a firmness and a determination to protect themselves and realistically assess the threat that Russia poses.
Well, Russia has always been the threat, no matter what you call them for us. the Finns are even better at understanding this than we are. But for us, yeah, it's been Russia since the 1600s. So yeah.
Yeah. It's the same old, unfortunately. Now, Zelensky is in the US. He will be presenting what is being termed a peace plan, but in fact, really, it's a victory plan. It's a plan to convince allies that he is able, given the right resources, to actually achieve a full and comprehensive victory against Russia, not simply cede territories and freeze the contact lines. How important is it that Zelensky is able to communicate this and that allies actually buy into the plan for victory? Because it's difficult, isn't it, for allies to sort of muster support unless they themselves buy into the idea of victory. And unfortunately, we haven't really heard anything from any Western allies about what their conception of victory is. In fact, they say the opposite, that it's not up to them to define what victory is. But that, rather than being a statement that gives agents to Ukraine, that actually is starting to feel a bit like a cop-out, a bit like an excuse, because if you don't define victory, then you don't have to deliver what's required to achieve that.
Exactly. No, but I think, like in everything else, if you have a goal to work for and not only victory, that's a grand goal. But you need to have a goal and you need to have stages on the way to achieve to be able to do that. And that makes everything a lot easier. It's easier to communicate to your allies. It's easier for the politician or high command to communicate out to us soldiers that in this stage, this is what we expect the outcome to be. And in the long run, this is what my goal is. And yeah, in the long run, the goal is peace and free Ukraine. But we need to have goals before that so we have something to work at. Otherwise, I think the task is a bit daunting right now.
And unfortunately, that sort of conversation around victory and tying it to the idea of peace, but peace without victory is no peace at all. Anyone who understands, Russian history, I think will understand that. But there is also talk about having a peace summit later in the year, and that Russia and China are going to be there. That, at this point, sounds extraordinary, given that China is supporting Russia, not just with dual-use technologies, but with, it is thought, military support, quite substantial military support as well, and has, until recently, been the main supporter of the Russian war economy, keeping that going, and the largest importer-exporter of products into the Russian market. Is this your view both premature and also quite dangerous to talk about peace summits and have certainly two of the most authoritarian states in the world who've formed an alliance essentially to try and erase Ukraine?
Well, I don't think we're going to get a peace if China doesn't go against Russia's will right now. On the other hand, China is a more money-driven country than Russia. So if China feels that, okay, has hurt us enough, or this will hurt us even more in the long run, I think they might actually change stance on this and force Russia to do something towards a peace agreement. But as long as China doesn't do that, I don't think peace has a chance, because then Russia has a market to sell their stuff, even though it's not a huge export. They still have somewhere to sell it. Iran and Belarus are not big enough markets to keep this going, but China is.
Well, there's an interesting point there with Belarus. Before we hit record, we were talking about Belarus, and of course, it has amassed troops and armor on the border with Ukraine. But it's also been reported that this isn't necessarily the newest kit, and they don't have a huge army, and no signs of the equipment to counter electronic warfare was seen on any of that kit. So is this just a bluff, or is this just something Lukashenko feels he needs to do? How likely or unlikely is him to actually get his army directly embroiled in this conflict, even if Putin is jumping up and down, screaming at him to do that?
This is something we've seen several times. This is not the first time that Belarus has pulled forces towards the border to lock Ukrainian troops in the north. But you have to remember that in 22 he ordered his army to join Russia into Ukraine, and they refused. He's a dictator, and as a dictator, if you don't have your army support, you have nothing. So he has to tread extremely carefully here, because if they refuse his orders again, he's done. So no, the Belarusian army is, as far as I can see, not a threat to Ukraine at all. First of all, if they tried to come into Ukraine, I doubt they would get 10 kilometers before they would stop. The fortifications up towards the north are way too well built and planned for them to actually be able to break through. And as you said, they don't have the countermeasures. When the drones and the artillery would start hammering them on their side of the border, that fight would be not too fun for a Belarusian.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. Well, I've got two more questions here. The last one will be getting us back onto the idea of victory, but this one quickly here. I mean, you've been training Ukrainian troops, you've been embedded within the Ukrainian army, you see and hear an awful lot going on. In 2014, one could say that actually the sort of Ukrainian army was extremely bureaucratic, lacked the equipment, and actually the sort of Soviet inertia, Soviet mindset was extremely widespread under threat of essentially annihilation. It has had to improve and change and really try to tear out some of that sort of Soviet thinking. Do you still see some evidence of remnants of that old Soviet style way of thinking, resisting innovation, or in 2024, has the Ukrainian army sort of moved far beyond that and sort of rooted that out? And if it hasn't, what more needs to be done to do so?
Well, unfortunately, yes, especially on mid and high level. In the combat units, things are a lot different. And especially if you look at brigades like mine, that is trained by foreigners to a big extent, and that is willing and actually seek the knowledge to change, you'll see a big difference. But then you'll have a lot of their old style of thinking too. It's unfortunately one of the curses we have to fight.
And I guess it takes time to.
Oh, it does. It does. I think we will have to drag that monster with us until the end of the war. And then when this is done, that is something that can be dealt with. But for now, it's something we have to learn to live, unfortunately.
And do you think things could change in the long view as veterans returning from the front and their experiences start to enter politics? There are many already in civic society, but do you think it's important that veterans' voices become far stronger within the sort of political environment in the longer term?
Yes, it is. And I think they will. I think we will see very big changes in Ukraine when the veterans come back home. There is a lot of things that they will not accept anymore. There's a lot of things that they do not agree with anymore. A lot of the old ways have been accepted because it's just the way things are. Those things are going to be changed, I'm certain of it.
And the last question here really comes back to what we were talking about was Western complacency in some countries, the sort of lack of seriousness and recognition of the threat Russia poses, and just bureaucratic inertia. What now is required of Ukraine's Western allies in order to achieve victory? What do they need to be doing? What do they need to be supplying if they're going to get serious about the idea of Ukraine not just surviving, but winning?
Ammunition, airplanes, vehicles, anything. We need more of everything. And all of these silly, stupid restrictions about how, where, and when we can use them, they have to go. That's ridiculous. And it's a stupid fucking notion that Russia even would have reacted to the fact that we were using foreign weaponry on Russian soil. That was an invention in Washington by some stupid idiot who is thinking too much. Without the discussion in the West about these things, Russia would never have said a word. That would just have been a fact that Ukraine is striking back with what they can at our territory as well. Shit happens, but as always, I mean, the Russian intelligence are extremely good at picking up everything being said in our media, in our political circles, and they'll turn that around directly and make a thing of it out of it. I mean, we know how good they are, and they are extremely good, and especially at playing with Western media. So yeah, we made that bed for ourselves, and now we had to lay in it.
Well, there's a lot of people fighting that. It's frustrating sometimes that this doesn't always get through, and that some of these misconceptions and the fear that underpins, as you say, this is one of the reasons why Russian disinformation works so well, is because it also instills fear in the people that are receiving it. And you can, that fear is tangible in Washington and Berlin and other places that are putting these restrictions on. Christopher, it's fantastic what you and your colleagues are doing. I think the thoughts of everyone on this channel are with you as you head off once again. Yeah, we're rooting for victory and we are agitating to try and get Ukraine more of what it needs to win.
Thank you.